Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to the second in our series of webinars, following on from what I believe was a fairly successful one last week by James Hill. Still available if anyone hasn't seen that and wants a copy of it. By all means, email us or make contact via the website and we can send out a link to that. First thing I'd like to do, everyone who's on here, would you please be able to just raise your hand on the system so I know that you can hear me? That's lovely. Everyone's just raised their hands, so that's great. Thank you. Good. Okay, so the time said we've got a whistle stop to BS7671, half an hour. I'll desperately try not to go too much over that. I've got joining me today on the line Leon Smith, one of our senior trainers on BS7671, and Leon will be taking control of the questions and answers. On the system there is a Q&A box, so if you have any questions, please feel free to write them down and we'll pick them up as we go along, and certainly at the end we've got a Q&A session then. So I don't know if you want to just introduce yourself, Leon, say hello.
Good morning everybody, Leon here. Hope you're all keeping well.
Brilliant, that's great. Lovely. Okay, so without further ado, what we're going to be looking at briefly this morning is a history of the wiring regulations. We're going to have a look at the relationship to the electricity at work regulations, and then into the meat of it, which is an overview of the structure of the document. And then, as I said, at the end, we'll have questions and answers. So the first thing that I'm often asked is, what are they and what should we call them? So they come by many names. The correct title, as they come from a Senelec standard, but the British version is BS 7671 2018. And we're now on to Amendment 1. They're also entitled the requirements for electrical installations. So they can be called that as well. A lot of people will also know them as the wiring regulations. Now the IET was the IEE wiring regulations. And a lot of people will also now just call them the 18th edition. So lots of different names for the document. It's a British standard, so some people like to just call it the standard as well. And what do they cover? So the regulations apply to, as it states in the document, design, erection, verification of electrical installations, and also any additions and alterations to installations. Really importantly though, one of the really important things is that installations that are installed to an earlier edition, 16th, 17th edition, may not comply with the current standard of the 18th, but it doesn't mean that they are unsafe. It just means that they're not to the latest standard. Okay, so following the regulations, what are the things that we are trying to prevent? So fairly significant electrical fault there. And these are the things that the regulations are in place to try and prevent. So a brief history, let's have a really brief history. The Society of Telegraph Engineers came into existence on the 17th of May in 1871. And the earliest statement of the Society's objects pronounced that its purpose was for the general advancement of electrical and telegraphic science. And it was for facilitating the exchange of information amongst its members. On the 1st of January 1889, the organisation registered as the Institute of Electrical Engineers, the IEE, and that name stayed in place for over 100 years, when in 2006, the IEE, with various mergers and other organisations, became the IET. And in 1882, the Society produced its first edition of the wiring regulations, which were called Rules and Regulations for the Prevention of Fire Risks from Electric Lighting. And that was the first publication of the regulations. The regulations were then extended to include all aspects of electric wiring. And between 1882 and 1981, roughly the first 100 years, there were 15 editions of the regulations. So it's gone through a lot of changes over the years, and is now a document that is just over 550 pages long. Before we move into the wiring regulations themselves, it's really important to note that the HSE in their document HSR 25 make a statement that BS 7671 is a code of practice. It's not the law, it is a code of practice. But what it does say is widely recognised and accepted that in the UK, compliance with BS 7671 will achieve compliance with the relevant aspects of the electricity at work regulations. It goes on to say that installations to which BS 7671 is relevant and have been installed but are now superseded doesn't mean that they would fail to comply with the regulations. And this is something that we see over and over again with clients that have it explained to them that, oh, your installation doesn't meet the 18th edition. It's not up to the current standard. That's fine, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is dangerous. And it also, more importantly, doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't comply with the law, the electricity at work regulations. So just because we don't have compliance with the 18th edition doesn't mean that it's unsafe and doesn't mean that it wouldn't meet the legal standard. So let's have an overview of BS 7671. It's in 7 parts. Part 1 is scope, object, fundamental principles. Part 2 is definitions. Part 3 is what's called assessment of general characteristics. Part 4, we have protection for safety. Part 5, selection and erection of equipment. Part 6, inspection and testing. And finally, part 7, special installations or locations. There also then comes with the document a large appendices that supports the main parts of the regulations, and we'll have a look at that as we move through, particularly into part 4 and 5. So let's have a look at the parts individually. As advertised, this is a whistle-stop tour. So part 1 is in what's called 3 chapters. And the first chapter, chapter 11, deals with scope and the object and the fundamental principles. So it talks about what installations or which installations are covered by the regulations. And we've got here on the screen typical installations such as residential properties, we've got medical locations, agriculture, farmland, etc. So the electrical installations in these situations are covered by the regulations. It's quite an exhaustive list, as we can see here, all the way through low voltage generating sets, marinas, caravans, maintenance gangways, and so on. So it's a fairly detailed and fairly extensive list that's covered by the regs. The regulations go on to state what voltages and frequencies, etc., that it covers. So we can see here that the regulations operate up to 1000 volts AC and 1500 volt DC, with DC becoming more and more prevalent with changes in equipment that's attached to the networks nowadays. And then it goes on to say what is excluded. And this is generally equipment and machinery and so on that is excluded, generally because it has its own, as we can see here, British standard that covers it separately elsewhere. But equally what we can see here are, distribution, so the DNO type equipment, UKPN, SSE, that type of thing is not covered by the regulations. Examples here from that list, airplanes, as I said, DNO equipment, trains, rolling stock, that type of thing. Moving on through part 1, just last thing that I'd like to touch on here is probably my favourite regulation, which is 134. Good workmanship by one or more skilled or instructed persons and proper materials shall be used in the erection of the electrical installation. If you comply with that regulation, these sorts of things don't occur because they would have been installed correctly. We won't have cable damage. We won't have unsleeved protective conductors. if you follow that regulation, we won't have new trunking installed with new conduit and all the cabling just jammed in to the point where the lid won't fit. So just by simply following almost one of the first regulations in the whole standard, we can cover off through inspection and testing and so on. Okay, part 2, we're looking at definitions. So the document's got lots of words in it, lots of explanation. We've got the definitions here, goes on for a number of pages. Also included within definitions are some illustrations. One of the most important illustrations here is of earthing and protective systems. We've also got a list of symbols that are used throughout the document and abbreviations that are used in the standard. So that's part 2, moving on rapidly. So on to part 3. Part 3 is entitled Assessment of General Characteristics. And the best way of describing this section, it's quite short, it's only about 8 to 10 pages long, is probably the best way of describing it is a designer's guide. So if you're designing an electrical installation, part 3 walks you through step by step all of the things that you need to consider when you're designing your installation. It's split into 6 chapters, as we can see here. And on that basis of being a designer, as we move through, chapter 31, the purpose of the installation, what the maximum demand is going to be. 32, external influences. Is it going to be buried in the ground? Is it going to be outside with UV light and so on? So all of these things are the general stuff about the installation. And part 3 also includes one of the most important things when we come to designing the installation, what earthing system that we're looking at. Is it TNS? Is it TNCS PME? Is it TT, IT, PMB, and so on? So all of these things are encompassed in those few pages of part 3. Okay, moving on. Part 4. Now, part 4 and part 5 are the biggest sections, the biggest parts within the document. And part 4, as it says there, deals with protection for safety. Okay, and that's broken down into 4 chapters, although they're numbered through 5. One of them's omitted now. And the first chapter that we're looking at is what's called protection against electric shock. This goes on for around about 50 pages. Okay, and I'm attributing 1 slide to it. So as I've said, whistle stop tour. But what we're essentially trying to prevent with chapter 41 electric shock are things like this: open live buzz bars that can be touched. Okay, also dealing with fault protection, where things that shouldn't be live have become live, and that's all dealt with in chapter 41. Chapter 42 goes on to what's called thermal effects. Okay, thermal effects, but what we probably know better as fire. There were new regulations introduced into Amendment 3 of the 17th edition, and then they were enhanced in the 18th edition regarding, particularly in domestic locations, things to do with distribution boards and supporting wiring systems against fire. The London Fire Brigade have been very much influencing the regulations on this side of things. So lots of information and lots of design requirements regarding fire on chapter 42. Chapter 43 deals with overcurrent, and that can be overload current or fault current, one of a small magnitude with an overload, one that potentially could be a huge magnitude with a fault current. Here's a picture of an unfortunate isolator that has been subject to a long-term overcurrent and the damage that it can cause, the heat damage. And then we move on to chapter 44, which has been rapidly expanded over the last few editions and amendments to do with overvoltage. Okay, so overvoltage can occur generally through atmospheric conditions, i.e. lightning strikes, And it can also occur through things like switching on the high voltage side of the network, reflecting through the transformer onto the low voltage side and affecting things that way. So these are all things to do with over voltage. Chapter 45 was new to the 18th edition, and it's to do with isolation and switching. There's nothing new in the chapter, but it basically collated information from lots of other chapters and pulled it all together in one convenient place. Okay, that's the end of part 4. So move on to chapter 5 or part 5. Just while we move on to the next part and check he's still awake, Leon, I just wondered whether there was any questions at this point that anyone
Yes, we have had a few questions.
We just take one or two now quickly.
Sure, yeah, we have a question here from Glenn, and Glenn's asking, can the 18th edition exam be taken online from home?
That's a good question.
In
theory, right, the answer to that is I'm not entirely sure at the moment. In theory, practically it can be. I mean, practically it is an online exam through a system called Evolve through City and Guilds. The only issue is the invigilation of it, that you need to be able to make sure that no one is using material that they shouldn't to take the exam, etc. But I was actually on a call this week with City and Guilds, and they have started to release online and at-home exams for some of their courses already. So it may well be that in the near future, the wiring regs 2382 is one that can be taken from home. And what they're looking at is arrangements where cameras, you'd have a webcam that would actually look down on the material that you've got and what you're doing. So it would effectively be like a remote invigilation.
Great. We have another one here from Mark. And Mark's asking, you mentioned an IT system in part 3. What does that mean?
Okay, so yeah, just in passing, the wiring regulations in part 3 have got various earthing systems. We've got TNS, where the earth and the neutral are separate from one another. We've got TNC, TNCS, where they're combined. And then there are some specialist earthing systems, is probably the best way to describe them, that you find in specialist locations. So IT is an independent earthing system. I mean, typically found in medical locations and that type of thing. So yeah, just some specialist earthing systems that I don't know, account for a very small percentage of the electrical installations. Good. Okay. All right, thanks, Leon. I'm going to hold there. I'm going to crack on with the rest of the presentation, and then we'll wrap up all the questions at the end for everyone. Good. Okay, so on to part 5. Part 5 is entitled Selection and Erection of Equipment, and this is where the regulations actually get into building your electrical installation. So we've, at this point, through part 1 to 4, we've effectively got into the design. We've chosen the protection that we're going to use, the fuses, the breakers. We've designed what the maximum demand is and that type of thing. We're now into selecting the actual equipment that we're going to use and how we're going to install it. So the first thing that we have in part 5 is chapter 51, which is what's called common rules. And as it says, it's a set of common rules across all of the installations covered by the regulations. I've just shown here to give you some ideas. For example, cable colors. So we're familiar with the new, been around for 12 years now, new cable colors: brown, blue, brown, black, gray, and so on. The reason the cables are the colors they are is because the wiring regulations state they should be. And the labels that we see on electrical installations have to conform with particular wording, colors, sizes, and so on. And they're stated in common rules in the regulations. Chapter 52 is a large chapter within part 5, and it is specifically about the wiring system. I've got one slide here on it, but it's about choosing what type of cable you're going to have, how big, what size the cross-sectional area of the cable is going to be, dealing with volt drop. It's looking at making sure that we choose the right cables so that if there's a fire, they won't propagate that fire. How we maintain the installation. It's also not just the cables, it's the installation system, the trunking, is it being buried in the ground, and so on and so forth. And this is all dealt with in chapter 52 so that we can design and select the right cables. we're running steel wire armoured cables under the ground rather than a twin and earth or a small flex or something like that. So let's have a look at 52. These are the sorts of things that we're trying to avoid. This is a grouping issue. We've got too many cables in one location. They generate a lot of heat, and they're probably going to be potentially could be overloaded from the heat that the grouping's causing. Here we've got an inappropriate enclosure that's in a pit in the ground that's filled with water. So it's just an incorrect selection of equipment. It might be an installation issue, but certainly an incorrect equipment that's been chosen here. Then we need to choose the right type of cables. Initially, it might seem like that's a suitable cable for the environment, but over time, we can see here that through the cold and the heat, the insulation has split. So again, incorrectly selected cabling for the environment that it's in. Then progressively getting worse, we've got cables that are not correctly run in routes, doesn't look particularly neat and tidy, doesn't meet very many requirements of the regulations. Again, you know, a horrendous doesn't meet a huge number of the requirements of the regulations. And finally, this particular slide, this was an installation in a switch room that we entered. I entered personally as well with my engineering manager, and we opened the door and the cover, this is as we found it. So the cover is missing. We've got live terminals, bare live terminals here. You know, it's an absolute death trap. So all part of chapter 52, amongst other regulations as well. Okay, I'm conscious we've got 7 or 8 minutes left to go. So last few bits to go through. Chapter 53 deals with selecting the right protective equipment. So it ties in with chapter 45, and they go hand in hand together. So this is about choosing the right size fusing, circuit breakers and so on. Also leads on to control and monitoring equipment, because there's other ways that we might monitor circuits. Sometimes we don't want them to operate. We just want to know that things have gone wrong. And chapter 54. So we're into earthing, another big chapter. So earthing and protective conductors, here for when we do get faults. BS 7671 specifies that this is what we would like the earthing and the protective conductors to look like. So this is what the regulations are expecting you to install. In reality, this is what we hope to get. We hope that we get the right size earthing conductor. We hope it's connected to the right pipe, and we hope that it's got the right labeling on it. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, this is what we get. Incorrect colored cables, not sure if it is an earthing conductor or a protective conductor. It might be a phase conductor connected to the earth. Not entirely sure how that earth is connected and so on. So need to be really mindful of what the regulations are requiring compared to what we actually end up getting on site. And then the last 2 chapters of part 5 deal with what's called other equipment, which kind of sweeps up transformers and generators and equipment like that. And chapter 56, which is to deal with safety services. We're talking about emergency lighting, to the emergency lighting, fireman switches in garage forecourts and that type of thing. And that's chapter 55 and 56. Okay, moving on. We've got 2 more parts to cover. So we've got part 6, which is inspection and testing. Not too many changes, lots of changes in the regulations with the 18th edition. These 3 chapters disappeared and they've now been replaced with chapter 45 and 46. And really grouping inspection and testing into two elements. The first is in chapter 64 called initial verification, and this relates to new installations. I haven't done too much reading out, but I will here because it's this is incredibly important. We've designed the installation, we've selected the right protective devices, we've followed part 5 and we've selected the right cabling and the earthing, we've installed it. We now need to make sure that the electricians haven't made any mistakes, because believe it or not, we do make mistakes when we install things. And on completion, before being put into service, before we energize it, be inspected and of the regulations have been met. And where it's relevant, that is all 556 pages. So where it's relevant, the inspector doing the inspections needs to have a really good understanding of the regulations. They need to be a designer, they need to be an installer to carry out that inspection. Chapter 65 deals with periodic inspection and testing. And this is where we go into an existing installation. And again, they're looking to check that it conforms with the regulations, but in addition, it's a little softer. It's a tiny bit softer. Where required, periodic inspection of every installation should be carried out in order to determine, so far as is reasonably practicable, whether the installation is in satisfactory condition for continued service. They're looking to make sure it's still safe. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it does need to be safe. So what sorts of things might we find in an inspection? So I'm not sure it's overly clear here, but this is a volt stick, handy tool, unapproved test instrument, but very handy. And you can see it's lit up here. The end is lit up on the neutral. So we've got a lovely reverse polarity in this installation. Code 1 defect, something that needs to be dealt with immediately. Find those in inspection. Sometimes the equipment itself is quite handy and it will give you a natural inspection point. Okay, we've got a natural inspection point and we can actually see the cabling inside without having to take covers and doors off. So that's really good. And these natural inspection points will often extend to cable joints as well. So again, we can see inside the cable joint and we can see the cores and the cables there. I'm joking. Obviously, I'm joking. These are things that have been picked up during an inspection, corroded installations, damaged cables, burnt joints, and so on. And one of the things when we're doing the testing, inspection's incredibly important. Most defects get found with the inspection, but the testing will find defects that you can't see. This is the sort of thing that we can find with some testing. Good, so some specialist testing there, but looking to find the conditions of cables. We move on to the end of the presentation, part 7, last part of the regulations, apart from the appendices, special installations or locations. We're looking at things like caravans, caravan parks, street lighting, outdoor lighting, marinas, swimming pools, bathrooms, EV charging for electric vehicles and so on. There's a fairly long list of special installations or locations. This is it. And the main thing, if you look down that list with regards to these installations, is that they have generally got an increased risk of electric shock or fire or some sort of increased risk that's related to electricity. And so what we find with part 7 is that they will provide additional safety precautions for those particular installations. The last part of the regulations are the appendices. You can see here that they run on for the thick end of 160, 170 pages. Lots and lots of design information for the and use when designing the installation. Okay, so just in summary, at bang on half an hour, we have got the various training courses that are available for BS 7671. It's been around for, over 120 years. And it's no doubt going to continue to be an important document for as long as we're using electricity in our homes and at work. Additionally, there's a range of nationally recognised training courses, the most well-known being the City and Guilds 2382, probably the gold standard for the wiring regulations, and it's acknowledged by all the competent person schemes, such as the NICIC, ECA, NAPIT, HERS. They all recognise 2382. And as I've got you all here, it'd be remiss of me not to say that our training division do provide that training course as well. So BS 7671, if we can follow it, we can design to it, we can install to it, hopefully we can end up with more installations that look like this. Thank you everyone for your time. We've got quite a lot of attendees today, which is fantastic. Thank you for listening. We're now at the Q&A session at the end. So I'm over to Leon, who hopefully isn't going to throw me under the bus too badly. And we'll see what we've got. Do we have any questions, Leon?
I'll try not to. Yes, we do. We have some really good questions here. I'm sure you're going to enjoy some of these. Have a question here. It's quite, we've got been asked the same question twice actually from Greg and Ian. And it's asking, how often do the regs change and who polices them?
It's quite an involved answer to that. I'll keep it brief, like I have the whole presentation. Who polices it is the British Standard Institute. There is a committee called JPEL 64 that have lots of learned people on it who put the regulations together. If anyone knows anything about BSI, British Standard Institute, they are a they stay around and they make their money from selling copies of documents. So it's in their interests to update it on regular intervals. Typically, it's every 2 years a new amendment. So, you know, the previous version, the 17th edition, had 3 amendments, which effectively are 3 new copies of the document. And when those amendments have stacked up enough and there's some major changes, they'll move into a new edition. So the 18th edition was released in 2018. It's had what's called a corriendum, which is where there's errors, typographical errors, things that have been wrong. That was issued at the end of 2018. And as you know, Leon, it's just had its first amendment, Amendment 1, which came out the early part of this year. For Part 7, Section 722 EV charging. Now, the regulations have a lot of manufacturers who sit on JPEL 64 that put it together. And the main First Amendment related to some new equipment that's available on the market for EV charging. I should leave everyone to make their own judgments on that. But yeah, to answer, it changes, but generally a new amendment or addition will come out every 2 years or so.
That's great. Have a question here from Andy, who's asking, why are there no examples of test certificates in Part 6?
Yeah, okay. They're not included within Part 6 themselves. They are in the appendices, in Appendix 6. And you have got 3 model forms in there. They're copyright free. So you can either copy them out of the regs, or you can actually just Google IET model forms, and they are a free download from the IET website. As long as you don't change them, badge them up and so on, they're there. So you've got the 3 model forms of the electrical installation certificate, the minor electrical work certificate, and the electrical installation condition report with the schedules of inspection and the schedule of test results. So they're not included in Part 6 themselves, but in Part 6, they do refer to Appendix 6 to get the model forms. Okay,
there's another one here from Ian, who's asking, is safe isolation mentioned in the regulations?
It is. It's under Chapter 45, which I mentioned earlier, sort of collated all of the isolation and switching regime information together. And then in Part 5, the protected devices that would be used. Such an important subject, safe isolation. We do a lot of training with new starters, apprentices, and well experienced, you know, time-served electricians. And time and time again, safe isolation is just not understood. Behaviour means that it's not done properly, and ultimately it's the thing that kills. Electric shock and so on is one of the biggest things that kills. So yeah, really important, and is covered in BS 7671 itself, and is also covered extensively in the codes of practice, the guidance notes, sorry, that go with BS 7671. There's a whole range of guidance notes that go with it as well.
Great stuff. And we've got one more here, which is from an anonymous attendee. Bit of a design question, this one. Should earth rods be installed at the end of street lighting circuits, even though the DNO provide an earth at the control cabinet?
Yeah, the requirement is to have a earth electrode at the start and the end, well, the end or the penultimate column of the circuit. You can get into a long philosophical debate about whether the earth electrode provides you a better resistance to Mother Earth than the actual columns themselves. But as it stands at the moment, the regulations and the guidance do state earth electrode at the start of the circuit, i.e. the pillar, and earth electrode at the end of each circuit, or penultimate column. Hopefully you got that one right, Leon.
That's great. Do you know what? I do have 2 or 3 more questions here, but I think I'll answer them direct, Simon.
Okay, that's great. All right. Well, look, most people who watched the presentation have stayed on for the Q&As, and I really appreciate that. And hope you've enjoyed it. We do have our next webinar same time next Thursday, so 11 a.m. next Thursday. That's with Greg Jarvis, our connections manager, and he's going to delve into the murky world of EV charging and electric vehicle charging. So looking forward to that. Thank you everyone for joining us. Hope you all stay safe in these weird and wonderful times, and we'll see you again next Thursday. Thank you.